Good evening and welcome to, sadly, our last OBOC event of 2020. My name is Laura Peacock and I'm the chair of the One Book, One Community Committee, or as we affectionately call it, OBOC. On behalf of myself at Waterloo Public Library and my fellow committee members, we would like to acknowledge that our spaces are located on the lands traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We also acknowledge that our spaces are located on the Haldimand Tract and the traditional land of the Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. If you would like more information about the land on which you gather, please reach out to your local library. The OBOC committee has representatives from our 4 local libraries: Idea Exchange in Cambridge, Kitchener Public Library, Region of Waterloo Public Libraries, and Waterloo Public Library, along with representatives from Indigo Kitchener, Library Bound, Wordsworth Books, and community members. Over the last 19 years, the OBOC committee has been fortunate enough to bring authors including Richard Wagamese, Louise Penny, and now Waubgeshig Rice to our community. If you would like more information about OBOC, or if you'd like to suggest a book for a future event, please feel free to reach out to us. Throughout today's event, if you have questions for our Q&A, please add them to the comments section on YouTube or Facebook. We are continually grateful for community partnerships that help make OBOC events a reality, including longtime partners, the Waterloo Region Record and the Walper Hotel. I would now like to welcome Jim Poling, Editor-in-Chief of the Waterloo Region Record, to introduce our authors today.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Poling. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Waterloo Region Record. Welcome to the OBOC Pandemic Edition. This is a different format, but I guess we're all getting somewhat acclimatized to the situation we find ourselves in during this time. I'd like to introduce you to Waubgeshig Rice. He's an author and journalist and will be interviewed by Jesse Thistle this evening. Wab is a journalist at heart, and if you've read his book, or when you read his book, you'll see how the reporting informs the story that he does tell. Quite a story for our times. Wab has he started his journalism with the Anishinaabe newspaper, and later, I guess for the majority of journalism career, worked for CBC. Some of you may recognize him on CBC in his hosting duties on Up North. Earlier this year in the spring, Wab left the CBC to focus on full-time writing and pursuing being a full-time novelist. In 2012, he won an Independent Publishers Book Award for his short story collection called Midnight Sweatlodge. The book that he will be discussing with Jesse today is Moon of the Crusted Snow. It's a national bestseller and winner of the Evergreen Award last year. Wab is originally from the Wasauksing First Nation near Parry Sound. He now splits his time between Parry Sound and Sudbury. I'm very happy to welcome Wab here tonight, and leading the question and answer conversation is Jesse Thistle. Now, Jesse is an author and a PhD candidate in the history program at York University. Jesse, born in Saskatchewan, he moved to Brampton with his brothers to live with his paternal grandparents. His story is quite gripping and quite contemporary with some of the issues that society is facing today that are documented and chronicled from a first-person point of view in his stirring memoir, From the Ashes. Jesse continues to research, I guess, his family history, his own Indigenous culture, but he also acts as a national representative for Indigenous homelessness. It's a very stirring endeavor and deep and important work, and we're seeing, as I say, a contemporary issue where I think some of the issues that Jesse will explore and explode and bring to the fore will help society go forward, and we all will get a better understanding of what we need to do to go forward. So please allow me to welcome Wab and Jesse. Jesse, I'll turn it over to you. But before I do, I'd like to thank the staff at the library and everyone else who makes this event possible. Reading is so important, and I'm just glad that people are joining us, and we have authors willing to really open a vein and share their stories and help us all become a better and more understanding society. So Jesse and Wab, it's all yours, and thank you very much.
Hello, nice to see everybody. Nice to see you, Wab.
Hey.
Yeah. It's where are you broadcasting from?
My kitchen table in Sudbury. The sun is just going down to the west there, and there's some fall colors in the bush around our home. And yeah, it feels very timely to be chatting with you as we sort of prepare for winter, which is the storytelling season in many of our cultures. And yeah, I'm just really stoked to be chatting with you, Jesse, and really honored and pleased to be part of the One Book, One Community initiative. And just having my story, the focus of this program has just been really heartwarming and really fulfilling. So I'm really stoked to talk to you tonight. So how about you, Jesse? Where are you at?
I'm broadcasting from Hamilton, Haudenosaunee territory here. And I'm a visitor in these territories. I'm Métis Cree from Saskatchewan. And so our leaves are just starting to rust up, just starting to turn. So when I read the first chapter of your book, as the seasons are turning, as the winter's starting to set in, it's really apropos that I'm talking to you about, the connection to land and language and all the things that appear in your book. And I just want to thank you for kind of structuring your book around the seasons, and then laying them out in Anishinaabe Moan. You kind of create like a language navigation chart of the seasons through your book. What was your inspiration for that?
Oh, miigwech. Thanks for noting that. I think it goes back to just my general desire to have Anishinaabe reflected in the text throughout. I am by no means a fluent speaker. I have been hearing the language all my life, growing up in my community, but never learned it fluently for a variety of reasons, which we probably can all understand. Just, the general shame that was connected to the language for a long time, and how really our communities are only catching up now to eradicating some of that shame, and it's still ongoing in a lot of communities too. But it's been there. I learned it in school for a half hour a day. My grandmother spoke it fluently. My father and his siblings, they know it. They have a fluent knowledge of it, but they just didn't speak it as regularly as the generation prior to them. So it's just always been there, but it's been sort of out of reach for me for a lot of reasons. And I think I've been inspired by a lot of people around me. One of my brothers, Musqueam, namely, is becoming a fluent speaker and a teacher. So like for me, it's just a reflection of I guess, my own wishes and my own endeavor to try to become fluent again. So yeah, as a result, I wanted to make sure I injected as much of the language as I could. And really, some of the stuff you learn early on and some of the stuff that really sticks with you relates to the land around you and to the seasons and to the weather, to the trees and the animals and so on. So yeah, having like the Debwewin, the fall or the autumn, having it begin there, I think is important because, we grew up learning about how crucial that period is to prepare for Babon, for the winter coming up. So I think those are two really key seasons, and that's why I wanted to sort of outline the story in two parts, right? In Debwewin and Babon. So Debwewining and Baboning. And from there, I guess that was, an attempt to hold myself accountable too. Like if I'm gonna put this book out to the world and reflect my own comprehension of Anishinaabe, by the time I write another one, I better learn it a little better, I better reflect that in a little better way. So yeah, and I think just one last thing to mention about the language is, with that objective I had of making sure it was scattered throughout and having characters, engage with each other in the language. In the initial drafts, I would write, some dialogue in Ojibwe, but then have the character translate it, right? So the character would say something in Ojibwe and then repeat it in English. But Susan Renouf, my editor at ECW, she encouraged me not to always translate it, to let the reader figure out on their own what was going on. And that's sort of part of being an effective literary writer too, is showing and not necessarily telling, right? As a result, I scrubbed some of those translations from the draft, and I felt a little more empowered to do that. And I'm really thankful for Susan for encouraging me to do that, because as a result, I think there is some stronger language in there as a result of that. And it stands there proudly. It's not necessarily being translated for the reader, and the reader, I don't have to hold the reader's hand through some of those passages, right? So.
Yeah, it's almost like you take the reader and you drop them into that world, right? You're not explaining the dialogue. There are crucial moments where you do that, like when, I forget the Anishinaabe word for children. You'll say, hey, in Anishinaabe, and then in the next line, he's with the children, and that's who he's referring to. Cool. So I was learning words as I was going through, and I'm like, wow, this is like a cultural codex for people that are returning to their language. Cool. And it's out there in the world. And I'm like, just really thankful that you've done that. Have you thought about that impact that you've had? Like, I don't even know how many this is sold. This is like off the charts for, just to think about the impact that you've had for people like me who've been adopted out, who come back, and from us, just thank you for doing that,
Oh man, that's really special. That really means a lot. Chimigwech, thank you for saying that. I don't think often about that enough, I don't think, and the potential impact that could have. So it's really special to know. And that doesn't just directly come from me. It's me channeling all the knowledge and teaching that I've had throughout my life, and trying to portray that in a respectful and good way, right? And being accountable to my community at the same time. So I'm very encouraged and very heartwarmed to hear that. So Chimigwech, really
and there's certain ceremonies that appear like smudging. You have one in like chief and council where there's like a big, and it's in detail, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like you're recording and you're showing the culture to a larger audience. Was that your intention? You also do that with one of your characters at the end of the book where there's like a funeral type of ceremony. Did you have that in mind, or were you writing for Anishinaabe people?
That's a great question, because it's something that I've really wrestled with since I decided that I wanted to become a fiction writer. And I think the ongoing dialogue and I guess bit of debate that circles around incorporating ceremonial knowledge or actions into literature is a good one. And I think it really needs to be explored every time we think about writing these things down, right? Mm-hmm. And it really goes back to how our cultures originally passed information down and passed ceremonies down. That was through the oral tradition, right? Through speaking these things. And I think a lot of I guess the traditional mentality would be not to record these things in words and not to put them in books. And I think I made a decision early on in my career when I decided I wanted to write about Anishinaabe things, was that I don't have the authority or really the knowledge or expertise to, broadcast traditional ceremonial knowledge. Like, I'm not an elder, I've been in ceremonies throughout my whole life, but I don't have the, permission, first and foremost, to share some of those more detailed things. But what I do share are things that are accessible just out in the universe, stuff that you would already know about, like smudging, like certain funeral ceremonies that we're able to sort of access through other, pop culture or media or whatever else, right? So yeah, it's an important discussion to have internally, but also I think with our peers, with our mentors, and obviously with our communities, about what we should be portraying in books. Mm-hmm. So yeah, at the same time though, like a smudging ceremony, it's become rather ubiquitous. We do see it pretty much everywhere in universities. We see it, at openings for, at City Hall, even wherever we happen to live.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like a very intimate sort of rite. And it is, I guess, an expression of medicinal knowledge at the same time, too. So it's important to really know some of the background around that. And if we have the opportunity to offer that context, I think that's really important, too. And we can do that in books here and there. So, just to, answer your question in I guess, a more concise way, I think it's important that we put these things in books, but at the same time, we should know our limits and boundaries. And that comes down to respect of our traditions and respect of our communities at the same time.
Yeah, I think you did that in a very respectful way throughout the book, because there's tension between Evan and when he's in chief and council and they're doing the ceremonies, he's kind of he knows that it's part of his culture, but he's also alienated from it in many ways because of what had happened with residential schools and the shame and all the things. But you kind of use your characters to show that even in northern communities, there's some people that know their traditions well. There's some people that have been in traditions all their life. And then there's other people like his brother that play video games and they don't know much about hunting or anything like that. So how did you know how to manage those characters in those situations?
Yeah, that was really important too, because I think it's crucial that everybody, even us as Indigenous people, understand the spectrum of Indigenous experiences, right? So it's not either you're traditional or you're not. It's not this straight up binary that I think a lot of us have sort of been adopting as a result of being, Christianized in some ways too, or being assimilated into the sort of settler sort of mentalities around, politics, religion, spirituality, society, and so on. So it's not just that black and white. It's not either you know this stuff or you don't. And those nuances exist in pretty much every community, I think. And, some people know a little, some people know a lot, and some people know nothing at all. And that, all of those details and those dynamics of a res were inspired by my own and what I experienced growing up and what I witnessed specifically with people on that journey to understanding their heritage and, ceremonies and things like that too. So, it's, and that also sort of reflects the reality in that, again, we aren't this binary, and also, figuring out our common communities is really difficult, and portraying them in a realistic way is hard. And I think, you can speak to this as well in terms of your experience on your journey to your heritage too. It's not just as easy as, okay, here's how I find it and I got it,
Right.
It takes years, right?
Oh, it does. Yeah. And there's we were raised Catholic and my other brothers have connected to the culture differently than I have. There's some internal shame about doing these ceremonies. And I think you really captured that beautifully in your book, bringing that Indigenous knowledge and showing that it's a conversation that we're having, I want to ask you, how many moose have you killed in your life? Because the scenes around the moose hunting was man, you really pictured it, the blue of the muscle and all that. I'm man, it's incredible. How did you get that knowledge?
Well, just by being there, and I have not shot a moose in my life, but I've been on many hunts, and it's been since I was a teenager that I was really that intimately connected to that process. So that's a result of going out with my uncles and my dad, or even just going over to an uncle's house after they brought a moose back, right? And being part of that hiding and tanning process. So, those are things that I grew up with. I lived in my community until I was late into my teens. And then I left to go to university in Toronto. But that's all vivid, and that's all core foundational knowledge and identifiable knowledge for me too as an Anishinaabe person. So, those things always stick with me, and I hold those memories much tighter to me now that I've been an urban person for now more than half my life, right? For 22 years. So that's just something that's always been there. And part of this, of writing this book, was, you know, motivating myself to try to get back to some of that way of life, you know. And being in Sudbury now, we're much closer to my home community and to my wife's home community, and that was one of the main reasons why we moved here. So unfortunately, because of the pandemic over the last 6 months, we haven't been able to make as many of those you know, trips or have as many of those experiences as we would have liked. But, you know, that was part of growing up for me, and I'd love to have for my sons to have that similar experience, you know. So
yeah. Did anybody in the community go out when COVID hit? I know it's a little off track of your book. Were there people going out hunting and doing the things that were happening in Moon of the Crusted Snow? Were they?
I'm glad you asked, because you know, I've been asked this a couple times by other people just randomly, and honestly, I don't know that people are going out to the same degree that they would have before. Not in like big groups, as not big groups, but not in groups as they would have. I think people may be going out on their own because you still have to, right? Like you still have to go out and get the food, you know. But yeah, the pandemic, I think, has sort of thrown a bit of a curveball at that whole process. But at the same time, one thing I've noticed in this happened early on in the pandemic too, is that people really, and I think people in urban centers especially, started re-examining their relationship with food and how they get it, and just the importance of knowing how the land can provide for you, right? And how it's there for you. And otherwise, you know, even in a city like Sudbury, that's in Northern Ontario, most people here rely on food being trucked in. And you know, that supply chain evaporates, and what's going to happen, you know? So I think for the first time, people are starting to think about these things, which is really good.
Well, I think in the book, you really played that out. Like, it was terrifying. First off, the way that it was like you lit a long wick, and you just showed how isolated these communities are, you know, and how much they rely on diesel, electricity, all the resources from the South. So my question to you is, what would happen if they ran out of bullets, right? Is there going to be a sequel to this? Like, I don't, it ends in a place where I just wanted to keep reading more. Like, how are they going to hunt, you know?
Oh man, I'm so glad you asked that, because I am just researching that right now. Because I am, you know, developing the sequel, and you know, just starting the researching phase before I start writing. And seriously, like the other day, I think I Googled like how many bullets are left in North America or something like that. So I've been looking into, and I think it's in obviously the billions. That's how much ammo there is out there. But you know, that's not all going to last, right? And if industry shuts down, and you know, if modern technology fails us ultimately, you know, we're going to have to go back to, you know, making our own gunpowder eventually, right? So yeah, that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's where my head is at the moment, and I'm really figuring out how this world is going to unfold, you know, in 10 plus years time. So
well, I'll be buying 4 copies as soon as it comes out for sure. I want to switch gears a little bit, and your use of dream in the book really breaks up the narrative like expertly. And unless you're a writer, you don't realize how you're carrying the narrative. How did you choose your spots to have these moments of dream, right? Because that's a very Indigenous way of knowing the world, right? And you give it primacy, right? You don't minimize it, you give it primacy, and it carries the story. So how did you decide that?
Yeah, well, those were probably the most fun parts to write out of it all. And not just because they were, you know, opportunity to get surreal or abstract, but it was a chance also to be a little more symbolic, and most importantly, pay homage to my background as a Anishinaabe person, because dreams are really important to us, right? If you have a dream and you think that is significant, you know, you'll take some tobacco to an elder or a family member who will interpret that dream for you, and they'll tell you what the symbols are. They'll tell you, you know, what it could potentially be foreshadowing, and they'll advise you on what you should or shouldn't do in your life to sort of make sure that you honor that dream, and also to follow the direction that it's given you. So I didn't get that deep into that mindset with those dream sequences, but it was, again, a chance to show the importance of dreams in our culture. So mostly, I think the dreams in Moon of the Crested Snow, and there are 4 parts where the characters fall into dreams, and that was mostly to foreshadow and just really a literary tool, essentially, to sort of build that tension a little bit and hint at what may come in the rest of the book. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up the placement of them, and I thought, it sort of came a little more naturally to me. I thought, okay, this, we are getting this far in the narrative with the actual prose, and I think we need to just step out of reality for a little bit here. Because the reader not only needs that, but I think the characters need that as well. You need a break from the chaos and the crisis unfolding around you. And here, what we're all going through now, it's really hard to get, I think, people to tune into that and to really step away and get their minds off things. And, it's easy for me to say, as somebody who's lived with dreams and has remembered them vividly throughout his life, to just say, to take a moment and think about, the other places that your mind can go, and think about your consciousness and feed it in a healthy way, and that can take different, forms for different people. And it's not easy to figure that out. But yeah, that was why I wanted to put those in there at those points, just to say, okay, we have these dream worlds that we inhabit for a third of our lives, essentially. And that means something. That's something that can really teach us about ourselves, and it takes us away from our current situations, for better or worse, I guess you could say, too. But the very last dream, where Evan sort of foresees Justin Scott morph into this, creature, this Wendigo sort of character, that was supposed to be more symbolic, and I think to really, build to the climax at the end too, right?
It was terrifying. It just, for those that maybe don't know, could you maybe break down what a Wendigo is, or the cultural relevance of that?
Well, the Wendigo is a character found in Anishinaabe and Muskego Cree cultures, and there are similar I guess, creatures in other indigenous cultures as well. But I'll speak to what I heard growing up and how we perceived the Wendigo. When we were little kids, the elders used to tell us stories about the Wendigo, which was this figure, this monster that would come into the community when it's most vulnerable. And that would mostly be in the wintertime, right? And it would feed off the people. It would eat the weak. It would infect minds. It would play psychological games with people and turn them against each other. And we were always told, if you eat people, if you eat human flesh, then you'll become a Wendigo. So where we're from, the whole idea of planting these Wendigo stories in the heads of people was to deter them from cannibalizing each other, right? Essentially. So it was always seen as a very bad thing to eat other people, even when you're at your most desperate. So those are stories I grew up with, and there are some much more sophisticated Wendigo stories, and there are even some humorous and entertaining ones as well. Like my dad tells a story about Nana Bush. I don't know how to say this in like a PG kind of way, but Nana Bush, he loses something. I can't remember what it is, but the Wendigo takes it. So Nana Bush ends up having to go up the Wendigo's rectum to retrieve whatever this item is. And I'm not doing the story justice, but my dad tells it really well. But yeah, those are, sort of the Wendigo stories we grew up with. So in the setting of Moon of the Crested Snow, like Justin Scott, I think is the Wendigo in many ways. And he has come into this community to manipulate and exploit it. And they ultimately have to find a way to defeat him, right? And you see as the story goes on, and not to give too much away if some of our viewers haven't read it yet, he tries to sort of manipulate people into eating some of the dead, right? So that's where the Wendigo came from, and it was one I wanted, and I give props to my dad in the acknowledgments who raised me with some of those Wendigo stories. So yeah, it was, and in the end, as scary as the idea is, it was fun to write about too.
Yeah, I liked how you did that. You weaved in like traditional knowledge through these oral histories into to like a literary realism. Like you were showing how it would actually play out on the ground, you know, and I thought that brought a real element of anxiety to your work, right? Because you didn't know what was going to happen next. How is this how does this translate into the plot? Speaking of Nanabush, there's a story in the pages of Moon of the Crusted Snow. Do you want to talk a little bit about what Nanabush is or who he is, and maybe a little bit of that story and the framing of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, Nanabush is a trickster figure in Anishinaabe culture, and he's either a direct reference or a derivative of Nanabojo, which is seen as the first person, you know, on this planet in this life. But the Nanabush sort of interpretation of that and the way that character stories are told is more of a fun sort of adaptation, right? It's more of a trickster, and those stories are mostly supposed to be funny. And they're stories that are often shared with kids, and it teaches them about, you know, their culture, their background, how things came to be. And yeah, as mentioned, they're fun. And those were some of my favorite stories I heard when I was growing up. And the one in particular in Moon of the Crusted Snow, I think is probably my favorite one. And it's about Nanabush and the geese. And I won't tell the whole story, you know, all the way through, because it is in the book. And again, I included this in the book because it's such a widely familiar story, and you can find versions of it online too. So that's why I was comfortable writing about it at the same time. But basically, it's a story about Nanabush in the fall and having to prepare for the winter, but being lazy throughout the summer and not really being prepared and sort of being behind schedule in terms of making sure he had enough food for the upcoming winter, right? So he hurriedly and sort of hastily has to make plans to figure out how he's going to eat. And he comes across this party of geese who are getting ready to fly south for the winter, right? So he hears them in the bush, you know, reveling and having a good time and singing and dancing and so on. And he goes up to one of them and he asks, hey, what's up? What are you guys doing? And the one says, oh, hey, Nanabush, we're getting ready to go south. You know, we're having our last party here in the north, and we're making sure we're fat enough to fly and we got enough energy to make the big journey down south. And, you know, we're just bidding farewell to our home here, and we're going to be back in the springtime. He's like, oh, okay. And he sort of eyeballs all the geese, and he sees that they are quite plump, and he thinks, okay, well, here's my bounty. Here's my food for the next little while. So he tricks them. He says, he goes back to the first one he talked to, and he says, you know, I got a fun dance you guys can do if you want. And he said, you know, you can close your eyes and just twirl around in a circle. And they said, okay, let's do it. And they all start dancing that way. And they effectively can't see and make themselves dizzy. So he goes one by one and wrings each of their necks, right? And then kills them all. So, you know, it's a very grim outcome. But that's how he sort of cheats his way into preparing for the winter. So he takes all the dead geese, brings them back to his camp, and starts eating them and gorges himself again, sort of as he's still in this gluttony mode and this greedy sort of, I guess, vibe that he's been carrying on since the summertime. So he tells his behind, I'm going to go to sleep now. You make sure nobody watches our stash or nobody steals our stash. So he falls asleep, and then while he's sleeping, something comes and takes all the geese. So Nanabush wakes up, he gets really mad at his behind, and he said, you were supposed to watch, you know, what's going on? So to spite his butt, he stuck it in the fire and you know, burned his butt. And then realizing, oh, that's my butt, you know, I'm hurting myself, what am I doing kind of thing. So he runs and, you know, he's by the lake and he starts, you know, sliding his butt down the rock until he gets into the water. So what he leaves behind is sort of lichen on the rock. You know, if you go to, you know, the lake, you'll often find lichen on the rock. So when we see that as Anishinabek, you know, that reminds us that that's the scabbing from Nanabush's butt after he set it on fire for, you know, losing out on all his his winter stock that he's sort of nefariously obtained. So there's a bunch of lessons there that you should be prepared for the winter. Don't dupe people, and don't negatively impact the world around you. And that lichen is supposed to remind you of that, right? So, that's an example of an Anishinaabe story, and I wanted to put that one in there because it related to the whole idea of making sure you're prepared for a catastrophe. And in Moon of the Crested Snow, a lot of people aren't, right? And there are various outcomes as a result of that. So it's in some ways that was a story that inspired I guess a modern look at winter preparedness, like the Crested Snow in the end, right?
Yeah. Speaking of Indigenous knowledge and traditional stories, we cannot not discuss the term ever or deadly, because it appears in your book a few times. Can you explain how that is a true Indigenous knowledge?
That's so awesome. It's so funny that slang has become so universal. And it's just there are just ways the vernacular in not just reserve communities but urban communities as well, right? And that's how you and I would bond, is we would see if we ran into each other and we started talking. That's how we would know. Somebody would say deadly or ever sick or hole or something like that. We would have that immediate kinship, right? And I think like the first time I met you was in Toronto after the Indigenous Writers Gathering,
that's right,
5 years ago. And that was the thing. Like, we had a conversation like that, and there were a bunch of Indigenous writers at this restaurant, and it was really feeling that camaraderie and that sort of kinship in the big city is important too, right? So having those words in there is sort of I guess proudly once again reflecting the way we communicate with each other and our words. But it's funny, I recently read Five Little Indians by Michelle Good. Just a fantastic novel, just a tremendous novel. It's about residential school survivors out in British Columbia. And it was the same thing. Like, she uses similar language, that similar slang, to really, I think, connect Indigenous readers to that book, that story, that subject matter, right? Even though that's a totally different nation and really, a different culture altogether. But when I read that, it was the same thing. I was like, these people are talking like how me and my people talk, when we're friendly with each other. And it's just, I think it's really important to reflect that in all of our stories, really.
Yeah, it was like a nuanced language, almost like a coded language that only, other Indigenous people know. Is your editor Indigenous or?
No. No. And she was really encouraging and really wanted to make sure that I felt like it was an Anishinaabe story, and the voice was authentically Indigenous, right? And she didn't want to really meddle with any of that stuff. She was there to make sure that the story was as tight and as strong as it could be. And she really helped me with a lot of the technical stuff, specifically the pace of the story, because the very first draft, I think, was about 75,000 words. And the draft that's in book form is barely 60,000. So there was a lot that was cut, and it was mostly just fat trimming. Like, there wasn't really anything major plot-wise that was removed. It was just ways of cutting down on some of the language to make the story flow in a little more efficient of a way, I think. But with the language itself, she didn't want to touch that at all. And as I mentioned earlier, she encouraged me not to include those translations of the Ojibwe passages, right? So she was just wonderful to work with.
Yeah, speaking of pace and like the way that the sparseness of your words, you're saying very complex things, but in the simplest terms. Right. That is actually the hardest, most difficult kind of language to write. And it reminds me of mid-century American writers, actually. Cool. Has anyone ever made the comparison between the way that you write and the way that Ernest Hemingway writes? Because he came from journalism too, right?
Yeah. Well, he was a big influence on me when I was at journalism school. And, I went to Ryerson to study journalism. And, we had to take English courses all the way through. It was just a requisite. And I think in first year, we studied can't remember what the name of the course was, but we read The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. And, you know, our instructor said, you know, he was a journalist here in Toronto for a long time, and he became a successful novelist. And he really utilized a lot of, you know, the skills he had as a journalist in his prose. And it was really that sparse, pared down language and sort of those punchier sentences.
Yeah.
And what Susan really encouraged me to stick with that same sort of strategy in writing Moon of the Crusted Snow. And when I mentioned all that stuff that was cut, it was mostly just like sentences that were a little too long, descriptions that were maybe a little too precise, that weren't that necessary, and getting back to sort of those punchier, more impactful sentences that I used on a daily basis as a journalist, right? Especially as a broadcast journalist, you know, we language is stripped down even more in the broadcast delivery. So yeah, that was exactly intentional, and it really, she told me, you know, like, you've been writing this way for your whole professional career. Why not use that to the best of your advantage when you're trying to write prose? And I think I will stick with that for the next little while, because it seemed to work really well, especially for a story that's, you know, a borderline thriller like Moon of the Crescent Snow.
Yeah, it was almost like that complemented the sparseness and the shortness of your chapters. I use that technique with my own book. Was that a conscious thing where you had like 1 or 2 page chapters as kind of a reward for the reader? Because once you finish one chapter, you're like, I can just get to the next. Was that a conscious thing, and just keeps you going and going, right, until 4 hours are gone?
Well, and that's what I loved about your book too. It's just that pacing. It's I think, and I draw from really Anishinaabe storytelling too. Like, there's no format or no set guidelines of how a story should be told or how long it should be, right? Mm-hmm. You know, a story is ready when it's ready, and it's done when it's done. So with some of those chapters, which are maybe like a page or 2 in length, I thought, you know, okay, that's all I have to say for this part of the story. So I'm going to leave it at that. And it's funny, I didn't really think until afterwards about how people consume books. Like, some people will read just a chapter at a time, and some readers would say, I love getting through it because, you know, I do 1 chapter a day, and some days a chapter would be like 1 or 2 pages, and that was like my reading for the day, right? So that was kind of cool to hear from readers. But yeah, and to get back to your question, it was mostly about just doing what felt right, and just not trying to belabor anything or try to stretch anything out for the sake of a word count or anything, you know? And that was really liberating for me, I think, as a storyteller. And, you know, I think that's probably going to influence how I continue writing from now on.
Yeah, it's almost like you have a natural intonation as to when to stop a story and when to start the next chapter. And yeah, I just really appreciated that, the brevity of the way that you wrote. A lot of authors write themselves into their books. Is there any character in particular that's in your book that you kind of imbued yourself in?
Not really. You know, the protagonist, Evan, is, I think, maybe what I would aspire to be, in terms of like a good family man, very skilled person, somebody who's connected to the land, knows what to do with a moose and knows how to shoot it first and foremost. And really just, despite all the challenges around him, he finds a way to keep things together and to really carry himself in a good way and really look out for people around him. And I think what I wanted to get across with him was that there are people like that in every reserve. You know, he's inspired by, you know, some of my friends and cousins from Wasauksing. And getting back to the whole portrayal of Indigenous people that we've had to wrestle with through the mainstream is sort of that binary once again, right? Like, you know, people in Indigenous communities are either, you know, from one extreme to the other. They're either, you know, destitute, in despair, you know, tragic victims, or they're successful because they've left the reserve. And that's sort of the stereotypical image most Canadians have or have had of Indigenous people who come from the reserve. And it's not like that at all. That's not the reality. It never has been. So portraying Evan that way was part of that. And, getting back to what I said, I would aspire to be like that. But, with everybody else in the story too, they're inspired mostly by people in my community who do what they can to keep everything going and to make sure everybody's safe and everybody's healthy and sort of lives in a good way. The only thing I would say that is a direct connection between me and Evan is his last name, is White Sky. When I was, drawing up his sort of character profile, I was like, okay, his first name's Evan. I have a cousin named Evan. It's, I guess, a tip of the hat to him. But I was like, oh, he needs a last name, I guess. And I couldn't think of anything to call him in terms of a last name. So as a throwaway, I was like, okay, well, my name, Waubgeshig, if you translate it directly, it means white sky. So I'll just put that there for now. I'll put White Sky as his last name, and it's something I never got around to changing. So that's the connection he has to me, really.
Yeah, I really appreciated that about your book, the nuance and the family dynamics, right? They're a healthy family. They love their children. He's a provider. He's working. He's got 50 jobs basically, right? On the res per season. And it really showed the complexity of Indigenous Anishinaabe culture, and I really, really appreciate that. And as I read it the second time, there was one character that really stuck out to me, Eileen, at the end. And I was wondering, I didn't read your acknowledgments until the second time around, and I noticed that your grandmother was actually a cultural teacher. Did you write her in that way, or?
Well, when I was writing it, the character of Eileen had a different name, and then my grandmother Eileen died while I was revising it the second or third time. So I changed the name of that character to Eileen just to pay tribute to my grandmother. But they are quite different characters, I think. My grandmother ended up being a United Church minister in our community, and very much informed and influenced by her Anishinaabe upbringing. So she would do sermons in the church, in Ojibwe, but also hinting at, some of the teachings she heard from her parents growing up that were, more traditional and sort of in some ways hinted at the Debwewin way of life too, right? The medicine lodge. Yeah. So, it was a way for her. And I tried to ask her about this, later in her life, and she wouldn't really budge, but I tried to find out if she was in fact subverting Christianity by, including some of these teachings and these old stories into her sermons and that kind of thing. But she wouldn't really come clean. But I knew that's what she, was trying to impart anyway, in a trickster sort of way too, I guess you could say. But the character of Eileen in the book is more, I think, influenced and grounded in Anishinaabe ways. And my grandmother wasn't really like that. Like, she wouldn't lead a smudge. She was a little more stubborn and maybe a little more crusty than the character of Eileen is in the book. But what she ultimately represents in the book, I think, and my grandmother as well, is really like the pillar woman figure that everybody rallies around and really confides in as sort of a cultural influence, but at the same time, just an elder leader, And I think it's mostly, like where I'm from, it's mostly women who take that role. And, having Eileen as the central figure in the story, I think really it was important for me to reflect that, because the stories where I'm from are of the women, directing the men to take certain action, right? The women would get together and say, this is what you guys should do when you're negotiating this treaty with, the settlers, or this is what you should do when you're going to go trade with these guys, and this is what we want back, kind of thing, right? So yeah, that's sort of why I wanted to have that one central woman figure in the story, and it was just a nice way to pay homage to my grandmother at the same time.
Yeah, I thought it was beautiful. It's like almost like a fulcrum where you see kind of that generation passing, and then I won't ruin the story. It goes into the other part of the book where Evan and his family are making their way in the world.
Mhm.
I've heard over and over in the news and all across, like all the reviews of this book have termed it post-apocalyptic. And I was wondering, after my second reading, I think it's more apt to call it a return to Indigenous culture or even a re-indigenization. What do you think about that perspective of post-apocalyptic or re-indigenization?
Oh, I love that, man. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I post-apocalyptic is the easiest way to describe it, and I think if you only had like 10 words to attach, a little descriptor to it, of course, post-apocalyptic would be there. But I have never really seen it as a post-apocalyptic story myself. If you want to call it post anything, I would call it post-urban. It's a way to think about life after our cities fail. And after our technologies that we've become so reliant upon fail and don't come back, and what's going to be there really is the land. The land is what's going to help us survive. And it always has been there. It was there 150, 200 years ago for basically everybody until everything got industrialized, right? So not just Indigenous people, but I think people who've settled here as well have become disconnected from that. And I think as a result, we're a weaker society, we're a weaker civilization because we don't respect the land as much as we used to, and we don't confide in it, and we don't coexist with it like we should, And in many ways, reconnecting with that is re-indigenizing ourselves as Indigenous people first and foremost, but also, getting the wider society to think about ways, to think about that connection in a more Indigenous way, I guess, because, people thrived on this land since time immemorial. And they knew everything was out there that they needed. And, from medicine to food to supplies to infrastructure, everything else was there. And we've just been really, well, of course, Indigenous people have been, ripped from that. They've been displaced from that as a result of colonization. But modern technology, again, has also disconnected people from that as well. So, yeah, I would say, in many ways, like the story for me is a love letter to the land, and it's motivation, as I said earlier, for me as an individual, but for hopefully the people around me to make that connection once again, and to, use an Indigenous sort of way to think about how we live on the land and how we live with it.
Yeah, I liked how you kind of pitted. There was like a juxtaposition. There was a conversation near the end of the book between Scott and Evan. And Scott said something, a terrible white man said something about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people not knowing. And then Evan kind of retorts and says, we remember the land because we're Indigenous. And it kind of like speaks to like the whole like arc of the story. And I really, really liked how you played those two characters off each other, and how there is a return to Indigenous knowledge that's within us, right? That's within us,
I agree. And as that there's no easy way getting there. I know for sure there's no easy way to get there, but, we draw inspiration from each other and from, our fellow storytellers. And that's what I, have always admired about you and being so candid about your journey and just how important it is for us to come back to these things, or to try to find them in the first place,
Yeah. So you use tobacco throughout the whole book in a really kind of cool way. I do the same thing with my book where I'm trying to use the sacred within the contemporary. Like every meeting, people are smoking cigarettes. People are, you talk about the way that the tobacco looks and it burns, but then you also introduce ceremony with it and SEMA, and you show the protocols. Was that a conscious thing or that you're wrestling with while you're writing it?
Yeah, it was a conscious thing, I would say. And that's another thing, we've been sort of disconnected from, once again, is just our relationship with tobacco and how, it's become cigarettes and how that, a lot of people see that as an abuse of the medicine, right? but some people still see it as a way to connect with it at the same time, and that's not for me to say are the way. I would never judge whatsoever, but it is one of the medicines that's there, and I think understanding what it is and what it's for, and how it symbolically helps us give thanks, and give back to the earth in sort of a tangible way as well is really important. And I think it's one of the first things you really know about. And it's, again, another one of those things that's become ubiquitous enough that people of settler backgrounds understand what it is and what it's for, and just how that process and that practice is really integral in making that sort of connection with the world around you by offering something back whenever you take something, right? So it's that sense of reciprocity, that's what it can be, is just like a tangible way to be reciprocal, even if you are just, offering back a bit of a plant for something bigger that you might have taken. It's about understanding that balance, that spiritual balance that you should have with the land around you.
Yeah, I like how, I think it was Evan, someone had killed a moose and he didn't have tobacco. He had cigarettes, and he's like, "Oh, this will do," right? Yeah. He breaks it open, and he's creating that relationship, right?
Yeah.
Any means, right? So
yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I've done that before when I was a smoker. I was like, "Oh, shit, I don't have any tobacco. So break up this dart and this will have to do for now."
For sure. I've seen it done in ceremony at university all the time. Yeah. People do that. Yeah. Would you say that your book is like a roadmap to recreate or reestablish relationships then? Like, because you do lay that chart out where people are returning to the land, right?
I wouldn't call it a roadmap. I'd call it maybe a little glimpse into how that can happen, or how you might be able to get started. And, I would, I present this story and I wrote it in a humble way. And I want people to understand that I'm just one guy. I'm just one writer with one experience from one community, and this is just one of the ways that people, I think, can maybe, revive those old ways and reclaim them in many ways too. But somebody from, the reserve just up the highway from me would see it a little differently. Somebody from Waubgeshig First Nation might have a different outlook on how that can be done, right?
Right.
So yeah, like I don't think I intended it to be anything that profound in that sense, rather it being just a way to look at things and a way you could go about that kind of thing, So,
right.
Yeah, but at the same time, I really need to respect and really honor the people who came before me and the people who shaped who I am today and empowered and equipped me with these ways of telling these stories, right? So, that's just, I always make sure I try to give thanks in that sense as well.
Oh, as we wind down, we're coming close to the end of the session for our question and answer. What's next on the agenda for Moon with the Crusted Snow? Is there going to be a special edition hardcover copy that we can all buy, or what? Like, what's on the horizon?
There's gonna be like an appendix with a total survival guide coming next. How to make gunpowder from the bush. I'm working on the sequel. I wasn't planning on writing a sequel to this when I was all done with it. I thought, okay, that story is done. I'm happy with how it turned out. It said what I wanted it to say, and I'll move on to whatever is coming next. But the response was really good and really overwhelming for me in a lot of ways. And the story took on, I guess, a life of its own. And here we are almost 2 years after its publication. And I'm still having opportunities to talk about it. There's still people in communities like the Waterloo region picking it as sort of a wider focus to really explore, storytelling. And that is the greatest honor. And that's something I didn't expect whatsoever. So I'm thankful for all this. And because of that, my agent, Denise Bukowski, she came on with me. We paired up after the book's release, and she sort of approached me and said, your book's getting a lot of buzz, let's sort of see what can happen next. So she started looking around to see what sort of interest there was in a sequel, and thankfully there was. Penguin Random House was interested in sort of a next part of the story. So just this past spring, we signed a deal to develop the next part. So I left my job at CBC because some other opportunities came up as well. I got a couple of grants to do this next story from the Canada Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council. And I've been fortunate and blessed to be able to work full-time as an author now, first working on the sequel to Moon of the Crested Snow. So I'm still figuring out how the story is going to unfold. But basically, it's going to be about a decade after the end of the story. And what's going to happen is a core group of community members led by Evan and his daughter Nungos are going to go back down south to see what's left of the world, but try to get back to their traditional homelands on Georgian Bay. So, you know, it'll be like a quest story more or less, but, you know, ultimately it's a story of the ultimate reclamation in some ways, or an attempt at that, you know, to get back to the homelands after everything's, you know, sort of fallen apart. So we'll see how it goes. I got a lot more research to do. You know, I got to research how to make soap after the soap factories all collapsed. So things like that, right? But
at the end of the book, she's like sparingly washing the clothes, and I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to run out of soap. I didn't even think of like, you need soap, right? It's important. You don't explain it in the book, and maybe you're going to save it for the sequel. But what happened? Why did that all happen? You know?
I kept that vague on purpose, just to add to the tension.
Oh yeah, it did.
And you know, it realistically, if you lived in a community that far away, you probably wouldn't find out what happened. Even if some people came up from, you know, a city to the south and they didn't really have a full picture either. So it wasn't a cop-out for me. You know, that wasn't the reason why I placed it that far north. But, you know, I think, again, it added to that tension. But, you know, if the next part of the story is about figuring out what happened, I will have to explain the cause. But I won't say it now.
No.
And you'll read it in the next part of the story.
Yeah, and I promise anybody who reads this book, you're going to want to buy a diesel generator. For real. So, yeah, I don't know. I think we're at time here at an hour and a bit. And do we want to open the floor for questions?
That sounds like perfect timing to me. We have a ton of questions from the audience. So to get started, one of the first questions was related to the portrayal of Chief Terry not really having the ability to lead through the crisis, whereas Walter, who wasn't in the chief position, having more skills to actually lead. So the question was, can you speak about that choice? Yes.
Part of that was to highlight that the modern chief and council system isn't traditional governance. You know, the chiefs and councils that we know of right across the country today were created by the Indian Act that was signed in 1876. And where I'm from, you know, we didn't necessarily have a chief and council governing us pre-contact, right? Again, we governed our communities collectively and mostly informed by the elder women in the community, right? So the weakness of Terry is sort of to show that an individual isn't necessarily the best way to lead a community, especially in a time of crisis. So Walter is sort of the more humble character who has more of the skills, but didn't want to be the sort of symbolic leader in the first place. But Terry, a guy who maybe whose ego was maybe a little more influential, what got into that position in the end, right? So I think it's just to sort of show that conflict between, you know, chief and council governance versus, you know, what we used to know and how we used to govern ourselves. And in the end, yeah, Walter emerges as the one who's more suited because he's a little more humble and he sort of sets his ego aside. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily, you know, a widespread critique of chiefs and councils across Canada because, you know, my chief and council where I'm from, Wasauksing, of course, I'm related to half of them. So I'm not going to sort of, you know, totally, you know, bash them or anything like that. I totally support them as my community leadership. But, you know, that was just a way to show that there are different ways of leading. And it wasn't always necessarily having one person calling all the shots.
That's a really interesting kind of commentary. I think there's lots of different ways that we could interpret that within our climates, shall I say. So another question that came was someone was wondering why the adults had names like Evan, whereas the children had Ojibwe names.
Yeah, that again is inspired by my own community. Most of the generation prior to me have English names. My father and all his siblings and all their relatives. And, my generation really were some of the first who were being named in Ojibwe once again. And it was, I think, I was born in 1979, so it was a little bit unusual back then. But for me, it was one of the greatest gifts my parents ever gave me, on top of raising me in the community. And my mom is Canadian. She's of white background from Parry Sound, the town. My parents were living in Ottawa at the time, going to university when they found out I was coming, and they decided they wanted to raise me on the res. That's where they wanted to start their family, right? Where my dad was originally from. So, that was a huge gift. And then I guess inspired by that, they wanted to, reclaim our names and give me the name Waubgeshig, which is actually the name of my great grandfather. He, obviously had an English name as well. But yeah, so a lot of the other kids my age, and even a lot of the younger kids now, had Ojibwe names, the ones who grew up in the 80s and 90s. So I think that's how it looks in a lot of communities. You have a lot of the older generations using primarily English names, and then, their kids have names in the indigenous languages. So it was just a reflection of my own upbringing, my own surroundings. And that inspired me also to, name our kids in Ojibwe as well. So, hopefully they'll be inspired to do the same thing whenever they have kids.
So our next question is a question relating to whether you can comment further on Evan's thought when he goes door to door to inventory all the food. There was a direct quote included in the question. So he says, he was disappointed to discover how few hunted anymore. Many had grown complacent in the rut of welfare. So that specific quote really impacted the reader, and they were wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And Jesse, feel free to jump in at any point in time too if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I think Jesse may have some insights to share here too, and I think by describing it as the rut of welfare isn't to sort of disparage people who end up in poverty at all. That's a byproduct of being colonized and being displaced, right? Of being disconnected from your traditional way of life and your culture, and really being subordinated and becoming reliant on an external force that really has nothing to do with your background, or really has your best interests in mind. So as Evan's going door to door, it sort of reminds him that, the way that they've been displaced, the way they've been colonized, was entirely meant to disappear them, right? Like they were supposed to waste away in these little pockets of so-called reserved land. And, with being confined to those places too, because for a long time, people weren't allowed to leave reserves without a pass. So it's a result of, these ongoing measures to subordinate Indigenous people. And that's why the poverty has essentially, placed a lot of the people in this community in that position, to no fault of their own, I don't think. So is there anything you want to add to that thinking, Jesse?
Yeah, I think that's a very tough question, and it's a tough reality to talk about. The learned dependency that the government meted down upon Indigenous peoples through bureaucratic processes over time. And, when you control a population that way, you can take whatever resources you want from their land. So it was a very concerted effort by the government to dispossess Indigenous people and make them dependent. And so there are others in the communities, especially when I go back to home to Saskatchewan, who are very independent, who have never taken welfare, who've always been working, and like Evan, have 5-6 jobs, right? And so I think that Moon of the Crusted Snow does a really good job of nuancing that conversation, because he shows how some, were dependent, how some were like Evan, and provided for their family through their labor. And so that discussion needed to be had to make it realistic.
So there's a question here about where the inspiration for the story came from, and a comment related to the thought that the things we rely on so heavily could disappear pretty quickly, and yeah, where that inspiration came from.
Yeah, the first really moment of inspiration for the story was the blackout of 2003, in August of 2003, that impacted, a big chunk of the eastern part of North America. I was living in Toronto at the time, but that day I was back home in Wasauksing, house sitting for my dad. He and my stepmom were on vacation. So I was there with my brothers, and it was August, so the middle of the summer, and the power went out. And it was kind of weird because power doesn't always go out in the summertime, but not totally weird. We didn't think much of it, but it dragged on for a few hours, and we sort of thought, okay, maybe something's going on in town. So we got in the car and drove into Parry Sound, which is like a 10-minute drive away. And we saw the street lights were out there, nothing was working. We saw some people we knew downtown, and we just asked, and word had gotten around at that point that it was this huge blackout, and, nobody knew what was going on or when the power was going to come back or anything like that. So we got back in the car and we're like, holy shit, maybe this is the big one. And we drove back to the res and we started making a plan. We started thinking about how we were going to eat. We made an inventory of all the food in my dad's fridge and cupboards. We started gathering wood from the bush in case we needed to make fire for whatever reason. And we, checked all the backs of the toilets for water in case we needed it. And we started thinking about the people that we would go to on the res, who we could help or who could help us, and just who would be resourceful in terms of going out to get food or providing shelter or whatever else needed to happen, right? And it was really comforting in a lot of ways, because we were like, okay, we know we're in a good spot if this is really a really serious situation. We're in our home community. We're surrounded by skilled people. We're sort of off the beaten path in some ways, and we can ride this out here, essentially. So the power stayed out overnight, was still off the next morning. And later that morning, I guess, we decided that we were going to go fishing, because we're like, okay, this is how we're going to have to eat now, right? So we got all our fishing gear together and went down to the water, and we're about to go fishing. But then the power came back on, and we sort of almost immediately forgot about all that stuff, because we're like, okay, good, our cell phone's working again, and we can play PlayStation and so on, right? But it had a huge impact on me in the years after, because I lived in Toronto for, I think, another 4 or 5 years after that. And I always thought, if that happens again, first place I'm going is up Highway 400 to Wasauksing, and by sort of all any means necessary, I'm going to get home, because that's where I want to be if the world ends, kind of thing. So that really stuck with me for a long time. And a few years after that, I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which is a post-apocalyptic story. And I'd always loved that kind of book since I was a teenager, right? Like studying those kinds of books in high school. And one thing that I really noticed in that story, though, as much as I enjoyed it, it wasn't about building community at all after the end of the world. It was just about survival and being on your own. And I thought back to our experience in Wasauksing during the blackout, and I thought it was totally opposite. We were thinking about who we were going to get together with and how we were going to protect ourselves and each other. And that sentiment doesn't really come across at all in a book like The Road, or in many other sort of post-apocalyptic or dystopian stories. And, I attributed that to that Indigenous worldview and that sort of idea of community building and community sustenance, and really survival that had already been ingrained in our people, having survived the end of the world already by being colonized, right? So at that point, I thought, if I ever write a story like this, it's going to be like that. It's going to be about how people can come together, how they can find salvation essentially in the land, and how they can really look to the future instead of just trying to survive, and not really having this grim outlook about the world being over, even though many characters in Moon of the Crescent Snow certainly have that. It was just, for me, an opportunity to take a different lens to the sort of post-apocalyptic genre. And that's why I call it post-urban. That's why I prefer to call it that, because, I always think of myself as, a guy who was in his early 20s in Toronto and wanting to be post-urban, wanting to get out of there in case of a catastrophe like this. So it was roughly that period, in my 20s that really sort of kickstarted that for me. And I didn't start writing it until the fall of 2015, when I went to Banff for the Banff Center for Indigenous Writers program. But I started writing it then, and I had just been daydreaming it all those years leading up to that. And that's essentially how the whole story came together.
Can I ask one more question from because I want to know the answer to this. It's from Marnine McQuire Smith. Wob, she asks, have authors such as Richard Waubgeshig influenced your writing?
100%. Yeah.
You talk about
well, Richard in particular, I could talk a lot about him, and we became friends. He was a mentor to me, and it all started after Midnight Sweatlodge came out, which was my first short story collection. I wasn't really sure. Like I'm still figuring out how to be an author, right? Like it's a long journey, and it's hard to figure out the publishing industry. At that point, I really had very few clues, but I did manage to get this book published through Thetis Books, and I was really grateful for that. And that I sort of fulfilled this dream of becoming an author. But not long after it came out, and of course, I read Richard Waubgeshig's, all through my teens and 20s, and he was one of the first people I read that showed the Anishinaabe experience in a book. I hadn't really seen that, growing up at all. So he was a huge inspiration already, inspiring me to write and so on. But after Midnight Sweatlodge came out, out of the blue, I got this email from him, and he said, "Hi, Wob, I'm Richard Waubgeshig. I'm an author," and I'm sitting there thinking, no kidding, Richard Waubgeshig, this is like totally mind blowing. What's going on here? And he just wrote, I saw your book out. I understand you're in Anishinaabe, a young author, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you if you ever need any help or any guidance. I'm really encouraged to see an Anishinaabe author, fulfilling his dreams and becoming an author and putting, our stories out there. And it was just such a special moment to get that from him. So I emailed him back, of course, right away and said, this really means a lot to me. It's an honor to hear from you. You inspired me to be a writer, and so on. And we had this email relationship going back and forth for a couple of years. And I finally met him in person in Banff for a couple of years later for a conference. And we became good, pretty good friends after that. Always in touch. Whenever I had a problem with something I was writing, he always had some good advice. Whenever I needed guidance for publishing contracts, he was there to read them over and to say, make sure I retain certain rights here and there. There was also this one really cool moment too, though. It was during the sort of cycle for Midnight Sweatlodge. It was probably a couple years after it came out. I was asked to moderate a panel at the Toronto Festival of Authors. And he was there. He wasn't on this panel, but he was there promoting one of his books. I think it might have been Indian Horse. And he said, "Oh, are you going to Toronto?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to go. I'll be there." And he's like, "Oh, me too." And he said, "Well, when you get there, send me a text. We'll go down to the lobby, have a coffee, and just hang out." So it was one of my first festival experiences, and I was actually really nervous because I didn't know what to expect. I had like a serious sense of imposter syndrome. I was like, what am I doing here? Am I a bona fide author? Do I deserve to be here, kind of thing? It's something I think a lot of us go through. But I met him down there, and he picked a table in the lobby cafe that was pretty much as far out as possible, pretty much right in the lobby. And we sat there for, about an hour and a half. And every author who came by, he flagged them over and he said, "Oh, hey, I want you to meet Waubgeshig. He's an author, and this is the book he wrote," and so on. And I met all these authors who were there for the festival as a result of him, inviting me to coffee that day. And I didn't realize until after that was deliberate on his part. He knew that I was new to this world and that I was probably nervous and not really sure of myself and my standing as an author, and that I needed sort of a boost of confidence and I needed to meet more people. And he's, strategically found that spot for us where I met, dozens of authors over the course of like an hour and a half, these big name authors coming through for this big festival. So that was the kind of guy he was. He was super generous, always looking out for other people. And that is sort of really ingrained in me, the idea of paying that forward, of being there for other authors as well. And I just hope that especially young Indigenous authors and emerging Indigenous authors, not just young ones, know that I can hopefully offer something that can help guide them on this journey, and that's I am there as a result of people like Richard and Lee Miracle and Richard Van Camp and Beatrice Culleton and so on, like just the list goes on, right? So yeah, that's sort of my connection with Richard. So thanks for the question. I'm always happy to talk about him.
I have to say, because Richard was one of our OBOC authors about 7 years ago, that was the general feeling that everyone had. He was generous and kind, and it was, definitely events that the people that actually got to meet him behind the scenes really remember forever.
Cool.
Jesse, can we throw that question right back at you?
Sure. I have never met Richard Waubgeshig. I think, is that how you say his name properly? I've never.
Waubgeshig, yeah.
Waubgeshig.
Mm-hmm.
Sheila Rogers is a friend of mine and was a good friend of his. And I didn't know it before I started writing that we have similar backgrounds. We're both adoptees raised outside of our cultures, and writing was our way back kind of off the street. So I've since read his book Starlight, and he talks about silence and the streets in a way that I know he's been there. And so I see a lot of what I would like to aspire to be that kind of writer, because he's way, way more talented than I am. So he's even in passing, he's set the bar for other Indigenous authors coming up. So I'm grateful for that, and for Sheila for telling me.
Yeah.
Do you have any other inspirations in particular, like any authors that really impacted how you got to where you are now in terms of your authorship?
Me or Wob?
You go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, okay. Maria Campbell. She saw me. I went back to Saskatchewan, 2013, trying to reconnect with my mom and my mom's people. They're Métis Cree Road Allowance people, and we're actually from the same community, me and Maria. And she saw me coming back like many other damaged, middle-aged adoptees, and she took me under her wing. And she teaches me. She humbles me. I got a big ego, so she's humbled me a couple times, and I'm learning what it is to be Indigenous from her and all the aunties that are connected to her. And so in that way, I guess she's doing what Richard did for Wob, right? Introducing me to people, teaching me how to be an author and how to conduct myself in a good way.
Yeah, for me, it was the people who, made huge sacrifices to be authors, to speak their truths, right? At a time when mainstream wasn't paying attention to Indigenous people whatsoever, and especially the publishing industry, right? So, people like Drew Hayden Taylor, Richard Van Camp, Thomas King, obviously, Lee Miracle, she has been one of the aunties to me too. And, she's great at, just that no BS kind of anti-guidance that you need, when you're trying to tell stories in this way. So people like that, and the list goes on, really. And I think I've had the fortune and the great privilege of meeting a lot of these, elder storytellers, and just to be, amongst them, and to share space with them, and to really connect with them in different ways. It's just I couldn't have imagined that as a teenager, right? And it's just totally mind blowing, and it's a huge honor. So yeah, it's of course I'm influenced by all kinds of different authors. I've been reading pretty avidly since I was a kid, but it's the Indigenous ones for sure who made the space for people like me and Jesse, and that we will always be thankful for, and especially because of the much more difficult journeys they had to getting published than we do today.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, Wob. You are one of those authors for me that cleared the path that we follow in. Cherie Dimeline,
Oh yeah, sure.
Gregory Schofield, all these authors, and now the path is wide, and there's like a new generation of authors coming through. So thank you for that, Wob.
Oh, miigwech, Jesse. Thank you.
So to end on a potentially, who knows, great information note, we have a question related to whether or not we can expect to see Moon of the Crested Snow on a screen.
Oh, good question. Well, it has been optioned. The rights have been obtained by a producer named Robin Cass. He's based in Vancouver. So he is working on a pitch now for a broadcaster. He's working with a writer / showrunner named Ashlyn Halfnight, and if everything goes according to our hopes, it will be a 6-part series, hopefully on some platform. And then I will come on if that deal actually happens to be a writer for the adaptation. So fingers crossed. You never know. Could happen, could not. But it's really cool to see that the story could live on in that way. So just follow my social media, and you'll know as soon as I do if it's gonna come together.
All right, well, that's all we have time for tonight. So I just want to thank both of you so much for being here. I feel like I'm probably not the only one that's going to walk away from tonight's conversation feeling as though I need to go and read the book again, because the context that you both have given and the discussion that you've both given, I think have, for me, not being intimately familiar with the culture has really shown me a new way to approach the book. So I just want to, again, thank you both for being here. And we really appreciated having you here, Wob, as our 2020 OBOC author. We hope that we'll see you again in the future. And thank you both again for being here. And have a good night, everyone.
Miigwech. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Wob. Thank you.
This has been an awesome experience. Miigwech.
Thank you.